The cold was a constant companion in the village of Stillwater. It seeped through the floorboards of Lyra's small cottage, clung to the wool of her shawl, and bit at the tips of her fingers as she copied records for the village elder. She was the scribe, a title that sounded far grander than the reality. It meant she was the keeper of lists, births, deaths, grain yields, and the endless petty grievances the villagers had against one another. Her own grievance was a silent one, a hollow ache she never gave a name to. It was the ache of being sent here, to the edge of the known territories, to be forgotten. Her mother, Matrona Ilara, had deemed her unsuitable. Not strong enough, not fierce enough, not blessed with the pack's sight. A quiet girl who preferred books to boasts was a disappointment, and disappointments were swept from view. So Lyra had been swept here. She was good at being forgotten. She kept her head down, her voice low, her work impeccable. She made herself small and useful, a ghost in the machine of the village. It was safer that way. Her only rebellion, if it could be called that, was Fen. He was a wolf pup, born in the spring litter to one of the pack's best hunters. But something was wrong. He didn't respond to calls, didn't startle at loud noises. The pack healer had examined him, a grim set to her jaw, and declared him deaf. A wolf who could not hear the hunt, the warning, the summons of the alpha, was no wolf at all. He was a liability. The unspoken rule was that such weaknesses were culled before they could endanger the pack. But Lyra had seen him huddled behind the communal hall, shivering and alone, his littermates having already abandoned him. She had seen the confusion in his pale blue eyes, a mirror of the loneliness in her own heart. That night she had stolen him away. She kept him in her cottage, a secret that could get her exiled, or worse. He was small, with fur the color of ash. He couldn't hear her footsteps, so she learned to stomp gently on the floorboards to announce her presence. He couldn't hear her voice, but she sang to him anyway. Every night, after the village had settled into a snoring slumber, she would sit by the low fire, Fen curled in her lap, and she would sing. They were old songs, healing chants, and forgotten lore she'd copied from dusty scrolls. Her voice wasn't strong or beautiful, just a quiet, reedy hum. She sang not for his ears, but for the vibration. She would press a hand to his tiny back and feel her own song thrumming against his bones. It seemed to soothe him. It certainly soothed her. It was on her way back from gathering winter moss for the healer that she found the man. He was sprawled near the edge of the whisper wood, a place the villagers avoided. At first she thought he was a fallen log, half dusted with the first snow of the season. But then she saw the black leather of a tunic, the glint of silver at his throat. She moved closer, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Strangers were rare. Dangerous strangers were the stuff of cautionary tales. He was massive, built on a scale that seemed wrong for a normal man. Broad shoulders, a tumble of night-dark hair, a face that might have been carved from granite. But it was the cold that stopped her breath. It rolled off him in waves, a palpable, unnatural frost that made the air crackle. The snow around him hadn't melted. It seemed to be deepening, clinging to him like a shroud. His skin was pale, tinged with blue at the lips. A faint tremor ran through his body, a constant, violent shiver. He was dying. Her mind screamed at her to run. Go back to the village, tell the elder. Let the pack guards handle it. This man was not her concern. He radiated a power that was both terrifying and broken. Touching him felt like it would be touching death itself. But then his eyes fluttered open. They were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, a piercing, depthless gray. They found her, and for a second, the shivering stopped. In those eyes she saw a desolation so profound it dwarfed her own quiet loneliness. It was the look of a mountain being ground to dust from the inside out. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The silent plea was one she understood intimately. Help me. Forgetting herself, forgetting the danger, Lyra knelt beside him. The cold intensified, biting at her skin through her clothes, but she ignored it. She was just a scribe, a forgotten daughter, a thief of broken pups. What more could they take from her? I will, she whispered, the words a puff of white in the frozen air. Getting him back to her cottage was a nightmare. He was impossibly heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She was not strong, but desperation gave her a wiry strength she didn't know she possessed. She half dragged, half carried him, her muscles screaming, her lungs burning with the frigid air. The journey that usually took minutes stretched into an hour of agonizing effort. She stumbled through her own door and collapsed, the man falling with her onto the worn rug. Fen, startled by the tremor, scrambled out from under the small cot, letting out a silent, breathy hiss of alarm. He saw the stranger, smelled the strange, cold scent of him, and his hackles rose. "It's all right, Fen," Lyra gasped, her body aching. "He's hurt." She managed to roll the man onto the rug properly, his head cushioned by a spare blanket. His shivering had started again, more violently this time. His teeth chattered, a sound like stones rattling in a box. She touched his forehead. The cold was so intense it felt like a burn. It wasn't the cold of winter. It was something deep within him, a living frost that was consuming him. Panic fluttered in her chest. The village healer, Elspeth, had remedies for fevers, for broken bones, for the coughing sickness. She had nothing for a man freezing from the inside out. Lyra was on her own. She did the only things she could think of. She piled every blanket she owned onto him. She built the fire up until it roared in the hearth, throwing dancing shadows on the walls. The little cottage grew sweltering, but the cold radiating from the man seemed to drink the heat from the air. The frost on his tunic didn't melt. Fen crept closer, whining softly. The pup seemed to sense the wrongness of the man's condition. He nudged the stranger's hand with his wet nose, then looked up at Lyra, his blue eyes wide with confusion. Lyra's gaze fell upon her satchel of herbs. She had been learning the healer's trade from Elspeth, mostly just identifying and drying plants. She knew the basics: feverfew for heat, willow bark for pain. But what for this? What for a living winter? She brewed a tea from the warmest herbs she had: ginger root, cinnamon bark, a pinch of fiery cayenne. It was a desperate guess. Getting him to drink was another challenge. He was barely conscious, his jaw clenched tight. She had to pry his lips apart and pour the hot liquid in a few drops at a time, praying he wouldn't choke. Hours passed. The fire burned low and she fed it more wood. The man's condition didn't change. The internal winter raged on. Lyra sat beside him, exhausted and afraid. She had brought a dying storm into her home. The village would shun her for this. Her mother, if she ever heard of it, would be disgusted by her foolish, soft heart. Fen, giving up his wary distance, crawled onto the pile of blankets and curled up against the man's chest, a tiny ball of gray fur against a mountain of black leather. The pup offered his own meager warmth, a gesture of pure, simple empathy. Seeing the pup's trust, a wave of resolve washed over Lyra. She couldn't fix this with herbs. She couldn't fight this cold with fire. But she could offer the only other comfort she knew. She took a deep breath, her voice wavering at first. She began to sing. It was a low, simple lullaby, a song about the sun returning after a long winter. She sang of green shoots pushing through thawed earth, of sleeping bears stirring in their dens. Her voice filled the small, warm space, and the vibrations settled into the floorboards, into the blankets, into the very air. She rested a hand on his chest, next to the sleeping pup. Through his leather tunic, she could feel the violent, chaotic tremor of his body. She sang on, pouring her own quiet hope into the melody. She sang of life. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the chattering of his teeth began to lessen. The violent shivers softened into a finer tremor. The glacial cold emanating from him seemed to recede, just a fraction. It was working. She didn't understand how. It was impossible. But she didn't question it. She just kept singing, her voice growing a little stronger, a little surer, as the man who was a living winter slept under her hands. For 3 days he drifted in and out of consciousness. Lyra kept a constant vigil. She forced warm broths and herbal teas past his lips. She kept the fire blazing, and whenever the deep, consuming cold threatened to overwhelm him, she sang. It was her voice, her song, that seemed to anchor him. The vibration seemed to fight the frost, to introduce a harmony where there was only the chaotic discord of his affliction. During those long hours she learned the landscape of his face, the harsh lines of his jaw, the faint scar that cut through one dark eyebrow, the surprising length of his lashes against his pale cheeks. He was beautiful, she realized, in the way a storm-ravaged mountain was beautiful, forged by immense pressure and ancient violence. On the 4th day, he woke. She was changing the damp cloth on his forehead when his eyes snapped open. The storm gray was back, but this time it was lucid and wary. His hand shot out, impossibly fast, and clamped around her wrist. His grip was like iron, and the cold was back, a sharp, shocking bite against her skin. "Who are you?" he rasped, his voice a low gravel. Lyra froze, her heart hammering. "My name is Lyra. I found you in the woods. You were dying," he finished for her. His eyes scanned the small cottage, taking in the roaring fire, the scattered herbs, the sleeping form of Fen at the foot of the cot, where she had finally managed to move him. His gaze returned to her, sharp and suspicious. Why? It was a simple question, but it held a universe of meaning. Why help a stranger? Why risk whatever danger he so clearly carried with him? "You needed help," she said simply, her voice barely a whisper. It was the only truth she had. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he released her wrist. A faint red mark bloomed on her skin where his cold fingers had been. He looked at the mark, and a flicker of something, regret, maybe, passed through his eyes. "You shouldn't have," he said, his voice flat. He tried to push himself up and fell back with a groan, a hand clutching his chest. "This cold. It's not a sickness. It's a part of me. It's poison. It will leach the life from you too if you stay close." There it was. The boundary. A wall of ice erected between them. "Don't get close. I'm dangerous." Lyra looked at the fear lurking deep in his stormy eyes, a fear not for himself, but for her. Her own fear receded, replaced by a stubbornness she rarely showed. Her mother had told her she was a weakness. The village saw her as a shadow. This man saw her as someone who could be harmed by his strength, and in a strange way it felt like a form of respect. "Then I suppose I shouldn't get close," she said, her voice finding a sliver of strength. "But you're in my house, on my cot, and you're not strong enough to leave. So you'll have to endure my help." She picked up the bowl of broth from the hearth. "And this broth." He stared at her, a crack in his granite facade. He seemed genuinely taken aback by her refusal to be afraid. After a long silence, he gave a short, sharp nod. His name was Kale. He offered it reluctantly, as if the name itself was a secret he was loath to part with. He told her nothing of his past, of where he came from, or what had happened to him. When she asked, he would simply fall silent, his gaze turning inward to whatever frozen hell he carried inside him. So she stopped asking. Instead, she talked. As she tended to him, she filled the silence with the small details of her life. She told him about the different inks she mixed from berries and soot, about the way the wind sounded just before a snowstorm, about the intricate genealogies of the pack that she was required to memorize. She read to him from her scrolls, her voice a steady murmur in the quiet cottage. She read tales of ancient alphas, of moon-blessed wolves, of the creation of their world. He would listen, his eyes closed, his breathing even. She wasn't sure if he was truly interested, or if the sound of her voice was simply a distraction from his pain. The cold was his constant enemy. It would recede for a time, leaving him weak and exhausted but clear-headed. Then, without warning, it would surge back, racking his body with tremors, the frost creeping back into his skin. In those moments, words were useless. He would clench his jaw, his whole body rigid as he fought the internal battle, and Lyra would sing. She learned that the songs of growth and warmth were the most effective. The chants of healing, the verses about sunlight on stone. The cold was a force of entropy, of stillness. Her songs were about life, about motion, about change. And they fought it. She would sit by his side, sometimes placing a hand on his arm or his forehead, and sing until the tremors subsided and the warmth returned to his skin. He never asked her to sing, but she could see the silent plea in his eyes when the cold began its assault. And he never thanked her afterward, but the guardedness in his gaze would soften, just for a moment. One evening, the cold was particularly vicious. He was thrashing on the cot, a low groan escaping his lips. Lyra was singing a desperate, frantic tune when Fen, who had been sleeping by the fire, got up and padded over. The pup jumped onto the cot and nudged Kale's clenched fist with his nose, letting out his soft, breathy whine. Kale's eyes opened a crack. He looked at the pup. His thrashing stilled. Slowly, deliberately, he uncurled his fist and rested his hand on the pup's small head. Fen leaned into the touch, despite the chill clinging to Kale's skin. "He's deaf," Lyra explained quietly, her song trailing off. "He can't hear you. Or me." Kale stroked the pup's ashen fur. "He doesn't need to," he murmured, his voice rough. "He can feel the intent." His gaze shifted to her. "Just as he feels your songs." The boundary between them was still there, but it was thinning. It was like spring ice, still dangerous, but cracking under the surface. He started to talk more, asking her questions about her work, about the village. He never spoke of himself, but he became a keen observer of her world. He watched her grind herbs, his eyes tracking the motion of the pestle. He watched her mend Fen's favorite blanket, his gaze fixed on the careful work of her needle. He watched her. And in his watching, Lyra felt something she hadn't felt since she was a small child. She felt seen. "Your mother," he said one afternoon, the question coming out of nowhere. "You speak of the village, of the healer, but never of her." Lyra's hands stilled in the bowl of dough she was kneading. A familiar cold, one entirely her own, washed over her. "She is important? In the capital? I was not suited for the life there." Kale's gray eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "You mean you were sent away?" It wasn't a question. Lyra couldn't answer. She just kneaded the dough, her knuckles white. "To be unsuited is not the same as to be worthless," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Remember that." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Worthless, the word her mother had used, the word that was branded on her soul. He had heard the truth she hadn't spoken, and he had denied it. A tear slipped down her cheek and landed in the dough. She angrily wiped it away. That night, she sat by the fire, Fen in his usual spot in her lap. Kale was propped up on the cot, stronger now, the bouts of cold less frequent. The cottage was quiet, filled only with the crackle of the flames. She began to sing. It was an old song, one she'd found in a damaged scroll, its meaning lost to time. It had no words she knew, just a haunting, complex melody that rose and fell like a slow breath. She closed her eyes, losing herself in the vibrations, in the simple act of creation. She sang of things she didn't know she felt, of loneliness and stubborn hope, of finding a flicker of warmth in a world of cold. A small movement brought her back. She opened her eyes. Fen, the deaf pup who had never once responded to a sound in his life, was lifting his head. He was turning, his small ears twitching, his nose pointing directly at her face. He wasn't hearing the sound. She knew that. He was feeling it. He was feeling the life in it. The melody was more than just vibration now. It was a current, a tangible force, and he was turning toward its source. Her breath caught in her throat. Her song faltered and died. Fen blinked, the spell broken, and rested his head back on her knee. She looked up at Kyle. He was sitting bolt upright on the cot, his gray eyes wide, blazing with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. The look on his face was not suspicion or curiosity. It was awe, and it was recognition. He knew. He didn't know what it was. Not exactly. But he knew that what had just happened was not normal. He knew that the power she used to soothe his inner winter was real. Lyra. He breathed her name. It was the first time he had said it with anything other than guarded politeness. Now it was filled with a wondering reverence. What are you? Before she could answer, before she could even begin to process the question herself, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed on her door. It was a sound of power, of someone unaccustomed to being made to wait. Both of them froze. Fen let out a low, silent growl, the fur on his neck standing on end. Villagers didn't knock like that. The elder rapped with his staff. The healer called out a greeting. This was different. This was a summons. Lyra's blood ran cold. She knew that knock. She had heard it on the doors of her mother's political rivals, just before they were escorted away. The door swung open without waiting for an answer. Framed in the doorway, flanked by two imposing pack guards from the capital, stood Matrona Ilara. Her mother was as Lyra remembered her, tall, elegant, her silver-streaked hair coiled in an intricate, severe braid. Her eyes, the same stormy gray as Kale's but utterly devoid of warmth, swept the cottage with disdain. They passed over the humble furnishings, the drying herbs, the sleeping pup, and finally, they landed on Lyra. So, Ilara's voice was like the crack of ice on a frozen lake. This is what you've become, a tender of strays. Her gaze then shifted to the man on the cot. Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of surprise followed by the sharp, calculating look of a predator spotting an unexpected prize. She didn't recognize him, not yet, but she recognized the power signature, faint and damaged as it was. I felt a disturbance in the currents of the territory, Ilara said, stepping into the cottage as if she owned it. The guards remained at the door, blocking the only exit. A faltering power, a drain on the ley lines. I came to investigate the weakness. I find you harboring it. Lyra felt her world collapsing. Her mother's presence was a suffocating force. All the small confidences she had built in this quiet life, the fragile sense of self she had started to nurture, all of it crumbled to dust. She was a child again, standing before her judge. He was hurt, Mother, Lyra said, her voice a pathetic squeak. You were always a fool for broken things, Ilara said dismissively. Her attention was fixed on Kale, who was now sitting fully upright, his face a mask of cold fury. The temperature in the room plummeted. You have no authority here. Kale's voice was low and dangerous. Even weakened, he radiated an aura of command that made the air thick. Ilara laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. Don't I? I am Matrona Ilara of the High Council, and you. She took a step closer, her eyes narrowing as she truly looked at him, at the bearing he couldn't hide even in sickness, at the ancient power warring within him. Recognition dawned. By the spirits. It's you, the silent king, hiding in a backwater hovel. Kale's jaw tightened. The silent king, the alpha of alphas. Lyra's mind reeled. This man, this broken man she had cared for, was the ruler of all the territories. The king who had not been seen in public for years, the subject of 100 dark rumors. They said he was cursed, that his own power was consuming him. They were right. Ilara's lips curved into a triumphant, cruel smile. She had stumbled upon the biggest prize of all. The council has been searching for you, Your Majesty. There are concerns about your fitness to rule, about the affliction that plagues your bloodline. She turned her venomous gaze on Lyra. And you, my worthless, sentimental daughter, did you think you could heal him? You, who have no power, no gift, nothing of value? She gestured to her guards. Take her. She has conspired with an unstable power. She has endangered this entire village. No, Kale growled, moving to stand. He swayed, the effort costing him dearly. The frost was visibly creeping up his arms. Stay back, Lyra cried out, seeing the toll it was taking on him. She looked at her mother, her heart breaking. She's my mother. This is my punishment. Don't. The guards seized Lyra's arms. Their grips were brutal. Fen launched himself at one of the guards, a snarling ball of fury. But the guard kicked him away with contemptuous ease. The pup yelped and slammed against the wall, falling limp to the floor. Fen! Lyra screamed, struggling against the guards. Leave the beast, Ilara commanded. It's tainted, like its keeper. They dragged Lyra from the cottage. The last thing she saw was Kale, his face a mask of helpless rage as the internal cold surged, his body freezing in place as he fought to reach her. And on the floor, the small, still form of her pup. Her mother had won. She had taken everything in a single brutal moment. They didn't take her far. Ilara's victory needed an audience. She had Lyra dragged to the center of the village, her hands bound and tied to the post of the communal well. Villagers, drawn by the commotion, gathered in a wide, fearful circle. They saw the Matrona's guards. They saw Lyra bound like a criminal, and their faces turned from curiosity to suspicion. This daughter of mine, Ilara announced, her voice ringing with false authority, has brought a great danger to you. She harbored the cursed king, a man whose very presence drains the life from the land. Her sentimentality has put all your lives at risk. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Fear was a poison, and her mother was an expert at administering it. They looked at Lyra not with pity, but with accusation. Lyra's world narrowed to the rough wood of the post against her back and the cold iron of her shackles. Despair was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. Kale was a king, and she had been a fool. Fen was hurt, maybe dead, and she was alone, displayed for the scorn of the people she had lived amongst. She closed her eyes, her mother's voice a drone in the background. She thought of Kale, of the flicker of warmth she had seen in his desolate eyes. She thought of Fen, his unconditional, silent affection. The small, fragile world she had built was in ashes. The next day was an eternity of humiliation. Children threw pebbles at her. The villagers she had served, the ones for whom she had written letters and recorded histories, now spat on the ground as they passed. Elspeth the healer tried to approach with a water skin, but Ilara's guards turned her away with a threat. Ilara, meanwhile, was consolidating her power. She had sent riders to the capital, announcing she had secured the lost king. She was negotiating, positioning herself. Kale was her prisoner, trapped in the cottage by his own failing body. Lyra was the public symbol of her triumph. On the second night of her captivity, as a freezing rain began to fall, Ilara approached the well. "Your king is weakening," she said, her voice laced with satisfaction. "His power is failing. Soon the council will have no choice but to transfer his authority." To me, perhaps. She smiled. And it's all thanks to you, my dear. Lyra didn't respond. She just stared into the darkness, her hope a dying ember. But there is one last loose end, Alara continued, her tone shifting. That wretched, broken pup you kept, it is an ill omen, a symbol of the weakness you invited into this pack. A wolf that cannot hear is an affront to the spirits. Lyra's head snapped up. No. Leave him alone. Tomorrow at dawn, Alara declared, ignoring her plea. The pup will be cleansed. It will be offered to the river, a sacrifice to purify the village of your taint. The world stopped. Thrown into the frozen river. A tiny deaf pup who wouldn't even hear them coming. Please, Lyra begged, the word tearing from her raw throat. Mother, please, take me, punish me, but not him. He's just an animal. He's innocent. Innocence is a liability, Alara said coldly. A lesson you have never managed to learn. Perhaps watching it die will finally teach you. As her mother walked away, something inside Lyra shattered. It wasn't just despair anymore. It was a primal, desperate terror for a life other than her own. She pulled at her bonds, tearing her wrists raw against the iron. It was useless. She looked up at the dark sky, the freezing rain plastering her hair to her face. She couldn't see the cottage, but she focused all her being in its direction. She thought of Kyle, trapped and fighting his own battle. She didn't know if he could hear her, if their brief connection meant anything at all across the distance, but she had nothing left to lose. Kyle, she whispered, her voice breaking. She didn't know what she was asking for. For him to save the pup? To save her? To save himself? The words came out in a choked sob, a confession torn from the depths of her soul. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I love you. The words hung in the freezing air, a desperate, hopeless prayer, a declaration made under the threat of death, not for herself, but for the tiny, innocent life she had tried to protect. Dawn broke, gray and merciless. The rain had stopped, leaving a skin of ice on every surface. The villagers gathered again, their faces grim. Alara's guards dragged a squirming sack from Lyra's cottage and carried it toward the riverbank. Inside, a faint, terrified scratching could be heard. Fen. Alara stood before Lyra, a look of ultimate triumph on her face. Watch closely, daughter. This is the price of weakness. She gestured to the guards. Proceed. Lyra watched in horror as one of the guards held the sack over the churning, ice-choked water of the river. He began to untie the rope. Look at you, Alara hissed, her face close to Lyra's. Still crying over a broken thing. You are just like it. Flawed. Useless. A waste of my bloodline. She grabbed Lyra's chin, forcing her to watch. I gave you life, and you have done nothing but disappoint me. You are nothing. The words hammered at her. Worthless, flawed, nothing. The litany of her childhood, the brand on her soul. A lifetime of rage, of shame, of desperate, futile longing for a single word of approval, crested within her. She felt the familiar urge to shrink, to disappear, to accept the verdict. But then she looked past her mother, at the guard by the river, at the sack that held the small, warm life she had sworn to protect. She thought of Kale, fighting a battle for his own life, a king brought low. Broken things. Her mother was right. She had always loved broken things. And in that moment, the rage died. It didn't fizzle out. It vanished. It was replaced by a profound, shocking calm. The years of pain, the weight of her mother's hatred. It was a cage she had been helping to build around herself. She had spent her whole life rattling the bars, begging the jailer for kindness. She looked into her mother's cold, triumphant eyes, and she let go. She forgave her. Not for Alara's sake, but for her own. She forgave the cruelty, the neglect, the endless judgment. It had no more power over her. "You can't hurt me anymore," Lyra whispered, her voice clear and steady. The moment the words left her lips, something broke free. It was not a sound. It was a release. The dam of a lifetime of suppressed power, held back by shame and self-hatred, shattered. A wave of energy erupted from her. It was not fire or force. It was life. Pure, undiluted, golden life. It poured out of her in a silent, visible wave of warmth and light. The ice on the ground around the well instantly vanished, replaced by dew-kissed stone. The villagers gasped, stumbling back, shielding their eyes from the gentle, overwhelming radiance. The wave of life washed over them, not harming, but healing. Old aches faded, anxious hearts were calmed. The very air felt clean and new. It hit her mother like a physical blow. Alara staggered back, her hand flying to her chest, a look of utter horror on her face. The life energy was anathema to her cold, calculating ambition. The wave rolled on, across the village square toward the river. The guard holding Fen dropped the sack as the warmth touched him, his face slack with awe. The light washed over the churning water, and the jagged pieces of ice did not just melt, they dissolved, turning the gray, angry river into a calm, clear blue. And in her cottage, the wave of life slammed into Kale. He felt it not as an attack, but as a homecoming. The internal winter that had plagued his bloodline for centuries, the curse that was consuming him cell by cell, met its opposite. The light poured into him, and the ice didn't just recede. It shattered. It sublimated. It was annihilated. The last vestiges of the cold vanished from his soul, burned away by the pure, unconditional life force of her song made manifest. The light from Lyra faded, not disappearing, but settling into her, a quiet, steady glow under her skin. Her bonds, their iron weakened by the energy, fell away from her wrists. She stood free, her clothes torn, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes clear and bright. She had never felt so whole. A figure emerged from the edge of the square, moving with a speed and grace that was utterly inhuman. It was Kale. But it was not the broken man she had tended. The paleness was gone from his skin, replaced by a healthy warmth. The haunted look was gone from his eyes. He stood tall and straight, radiating a power that was calm, absolute, and entirely his own. The silent king was silent no more. The villagers, who had been staring at Lyra in shock, fell to their knees as one. They had not recognized the sick man in the cottage, but they recognized this. This was the Alpha of Alphas, restored. Kale ignored them. He walked through the kneeling crowd, his eyes fixed only on her. He stopped before her, his gaze taking in her freed wrists, the new light in her eyes. The awe he had felt in the cottage was back, 1,000 times stronger. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before gently cupping her cheek. His touch was warm, for the first time, entirely, wonderfully warm. "I heard you," he said, his voice a low, resonant timbre that wrapped around her heart. "Not with my ears, with my soul. You called, and I answered." Tears welled in Lyra's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, of a joy so vast it was painful. He looked at the light that seemed to emanate from her, the power that now sat so naturally within her. "This," he said, his thumb stroking her cheek. "This is what I felt in your songs. You were never powerless, Lyra. You were just waiting for the right moment to bloom." His gaze shifted, hardening as it fell upon Alara, who was staring at them, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. "She is mine," Kale stated, the words simple, possessive, and absolute. They were not a threat. They were a statement of fact, a realignment of the world. "And you will address my future queen with the respect she is owed." My future queen. The words echoed in the stunned silence. Alara sputtered, her political mind scrambling to recover. She is my daughter. A flawed, sentimental. She is the one who saved your king when his own council left him to die. Kale cut her off, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. She is the one who broke a centuries-old curse with nothing but the strength of her heart. You called her worthless. The spirits call her a miracle. He looked back at Lyra, his expression softening. He did not pass judgment on Alara. He deferred. "What is your will?" he asked, giving the power to her. Lyra looked at the woman who had caused her so much pain. She felt no hatred. She felt nothing but a distant pity. Alara had spent her life chasing a power that Lyra had just discovered sleeping inside her all along. "You wanted me to be forgotten," Lyra said, her voice steady and clear, carrying across the silent square. "You sent me here to fade into nothing. I will grant you the same courtesy." She met her mother's eyes. "From this day, you have no daughter. Your name will be stricken from my history. You will be forgotten." It was not a sentence of death or imprisonment. It was a sentence of irrelevance. For a woman like Alara, it was a fate worse than any dungeon. She stared at Lyra, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. She had been erased. Kyle nodded once. "As the queen commands." He gestured to his personal guard, who now seemed to materialize from the shadows. "Escort the former Matrona from my territory. She is no longer welcome." As the guards led the broken, silent Alara away, a small, furry body shot across the square and launched itself into Lyra's arms. It was Fen, alive and trembling, licking her face with frantic energy. Lyra hugged him tight, burying her face in his ashen fur. "You're safe," she sobbed. "You're safe." She felt Kale's hand on her back, a warm, steady presence. She looked up at him, her heart too full for words. He smiled, a true, breathtaking smile that was like the sun breaking through a winter storm. "I have you," he said softly. It was all that needed to be said. 6 months later, the world was a different color. The capital city, which Lyra had only ever seen as a place of gray stone and cold ambition, was now vibrant with life. Under Queen Lyra's guidance, the ancient knowledge of life magic, long dismissed as folklore, was being rediscovered. She wasn't just a queen, she was a teacher, showing other healers how to listen, not just to the body's ailments, but to the spirit's song. The Silent King was no longer silent. Kale ruled with a newfound warmth and wisdom, his own power now balanced and whole. The curse that had haunted his bloodline was gone, broken by a scribe from a forgotten village. Their story was already a legend, sung in halls and whispered around campfires. But for Lyra, the best moments were the quiet ones. She was sitting in the Queen's garden, a place she had personally brought back to life, its flowers now blooming even in the cooler months. A book lay open in her lap, but she wasn't reading. She was humming, a soft, contented tune. A young wolf, his fur the color of ash and his frame now sleek and strong, trotted over and rested his heavy head on her knees. Fen was no longer a pup, but he would always be hers. He still couldn't hear, but his pale blue eyes closed in bliss as he felt the familiar, life-filled vibrations of her song. A pair of warm hands settled on her shoulders. She leaned back, resting her head against Kale's chest. He bent down and kissed the top of her head. "Thinking of what law to pass next?" he murmured, his voice laced with amusement. "I was thinking about how cold your hands were when we first met," she confessed. He took her hand in his, lacing their fingers together. His skin was warm, alive. "I was a fortress of ice, Lyra, and you walked in like it was an open field." "It was a very cold field," she retorted, a smile in her voice. "And you were a very grumpy mountain in the middle of it." He chuckled, the sound a deep, pleasant rumble against her back. I am forever in your debt. She turned her head to look up at him, her expression serious. We saved each other, Kale. You saw me when no one else did. I just returned the favor. He looked at her, his storm-gray eyes filled with a love so profound it still sometimes stole her breath. He saw the scribe, the queen, the woman who had faced down a lifetime of pain and answered it with forgiveness. He saw his mate, his equal, his home. So you did, he said softly. He leaned down and captured her lips in a kiss that tasted of sunlight, of belonging, and of a love that had been strong enough to thaw a king's frozen heart. The world outside could have its legends. Here, in the quiet of their garden, with their wolf at their feet, they had everything they would ever need.